Hello folks, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever it is that you're catching up on this lesson, welcome. I apologise for the loud and perhaps unusual piece to start this lesson, but all will become clear when we find out what it is that we're going to be learning about in this week's lesson. So without any further hesitation folks, let's get stuck in and find out what it is we're going to be looking at in this week's lesson. So, this is lesson 1 on the modern/contemporary period. On the Google Classroom, under the Understanding Music banner, there is something called the N45 Concept Workbook. So if you can download one of those, or if you've got your one from class, that'd be great, and turn to page 15 and 16, you will see all the concepts that we're going to be looking at associated with this period of music. So what you can see on screen, folks, are today's learning intentions and success criteria. So on the left-hand side, you can see that today we will brainstorm what we remember from the classical period on Jamboard. Number 2, we'll discuss what the words modern/contemporary actually mean. Number 3, we're going to look at and listen to different concepts associated with this period. And number 4, we're going to note down the important features that we look at about these concepts. And on the right hand side, you can see that after today you are successful if you can identify different concepts within the areas of modern/contemporary music that we have discussed. But first folks, what I would like you to do is to go onto the Google Classroom, and under this week's lesson you'll find what's called a Jamboard. Now you might not have used this before, you might have used it in some other classes. This is my first time using it and I want to see how it goes. So basically what it is, it's a giant doodle board that you guys are able to write down your understanding and your knowledge about the 4 corners that I've established on that Jamboard. So if you go onto it, you'll see that there are 4 sections, 1 in each corner, and I've written in a concept that I know relate to each of those headings. What I would like you to do is to do the same. So for as many things as you can remember from the classical period, I would like you to go and write down some information on that Jamboard. So feel free to pause this video just now while you go and do that. And if not, stick around and we'll get stuck in with the next slide. Next up, folks, this is a task just for you. Nobody else needs to see it. I would like you to have a think about what the 2 words mean, what modern and what contemporary means, and I would like you to have a wee think if you can name any modern/contemporary composers. You've got 1 minute, off you go. So hopefully you managed to get a few things written down there. Don't worry if not, because the whole purpose of this lesson is that we're going to find out what it all means. So to kind of kick off modern/contemporary, it really does mean kind of current, but we don't mean current as in the 21st century from 2000 onwards. What we really mean is from around about 1900 to around about 1960, 1970 is the sort of time frame that we're going to be looking at, and the sort of time frame that within music we consider those 60-70 years to be the core of the modern and contemporary period. Okay, so on the next slide what we're going to start to look at is a few of the notable composers from this time period. So what we're going to start by doing, folks, is looking at 4 of the main composers of this time period. The first composer that we're looking at is a man called Igor Stravinsky. Now, Stravinsky was a Russian composer who was born just at the end of the 19th century and lived until around about 1950s, 1960s. His piece, the most famous piece that he ever wrote, was a piece called The Rite of Spring, and it was actually the piece that was used at the start of this presentation. What he drew on in lots of his music was Russian folk tales. So The Rite of Spring is a piece that kind of goes on about the power of nature. So the kind of primitive aspect of the music that we're listening to, it was really jagged, it was really harsh sounding. That was really what Stravinsky was all about. If we then move to the second composer, we've got a man called Arnold Schoenberg, and he was a German composer whose main idea was to rearrange all the notes within music. We have things like major scales, we've got minor scales, and more, as we'll find out in this lesson. But his main idea was to completely forget about all that and arrange notes in ways that he wanted to. So he created a genre of music called serialism, which we'll find out a little bit more about. Not so much in Nat 5, into higher, but we'll touch on it a little bit in this presentation. What we've also got, we've got a French composer called Claude Debussy. Now, Debussy was one of the prime composers who used a type of scale called a whole tone scale that we'll find out about in this presentation. And he was a pioneer of what was called the Impressionism movement. Okay, quite like a dreamy sounding music, which we'll hear more of later in the presentation. And the final composer that we'll look at is an American composer called Steve Reich. Now, his main thing was to strip music back to its bare bones and create a genre of music called minimalism, which, as the name suggests, uses hardly any material, hardly any music, and it focuses on really kind of the building blocks of music with like rhythm and simple pitch ideas. So one of the first main points of the contemporary/modern period is that composers decided to move away from using conventional harmony. And what we mean by that is using familiar words like major key signature, minor key signature, major chords, major scales, minor scales, etc. And they moved to kind of a more ambitious idea by having no keys whatsoever and moving towards something that we call atonal. So what I'm going to do for you now is I'm going to play you a well-known nursery rhyme, first of all in a major key, then in a minor key, and then using atonal techniques, and see if you can guess what the nursery rhyme is. So if you guessed Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, then you would be correct. Given that it's a very recognisable piece, I find it's a really good one to show the difference between tonalities. So the major ones that we're familiar with, happy sounding. The minor one, again, not so familiar with Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but we're familiar with the sound of a minor key. But even though there was no recognisable tune in the atonal version, because of the rhythms, you probably still did recognise it. So it's not to say that atonal music all sounds really horrible and things like that, but it's just kind of putting it in a way that we maybe can relate to already. So knowing that it still does draw on things that we understand, but it's just doing it in a different sort of way. So in your books, on page 15, you can see on screen just now, there is the box that you need to fill in for atonal. Okay, so it means that there's no key center. It's neither major nor minor, and it sounds quite clashy. What you'll be able to do just now, folks, is go on to complete task 1 on the Google Classroom. So it's a wee Google form with some videos in it, and you're asked to identify whether you think the key is major, minor, or atonal. So what we're on to next, folks, is to look at discord and cluster, both of which are on page 15 of your books. Now, already we can kind of identify one common word that we know, and that is a chord. Now, a chord is a series of notes put together, okay? So the two types that we kind of know already for definite are major chords, chords which sound quite happy. What we also know, we know minor chords. So minor chords have what we call a flattened third, which gives it that sad sound compared with the major chord. But what we now have is we have two things, discord and cluster. Now a discord can be any series of notes, any amount of notes that fit together and sound quite unpleasant, sound quite clashy. So I'm sat there with both my hands squashing down at the keyboard, hitting as many keys as I possibly can, and combining all those notes together makes a discord. There is a technical difference between a discord and a cluster, though they are both really similar. A discord, loads of notes being played at once, but a cluster is when you have three or more adjacent notes. Now, adjacent notes are notes that are really, really close together. So a cluster would maybe sound like... Okay, so notes that are really close together, that it's not as heavy sounding, it's not as thick sounding as a discord. Okay, it's kind of lighter in texture. Like I say, they are two really similar words and similar concepts. Okay, but there is a technical difference between the two of them, just to be aware of. So you could fill in the boxes for discord and cluster now. If we go back now and listen to the piece that we started this lesson with, The Rite of Spring, you can actually follow the score along, and listening to it, you can see that the notes are all spread quite a far distance apart. There's lots of them and they sound quite clashy, which means that this piece uses lots of discords. Listen closely so you get an idea of how it sounds. So the next piece that we're going to listen to is by a Polish composer called Krzysztof Penderecki, and it's a piece entitled Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima. And the reason for letting you listen to this is that it highlights, whereas in The Rite of Spring we heard lots of discords, in the Threnody what we're going to hear is lots of examples of clusters, which remember are notes that are really, really close together. So have a listen and see what you think. So what Penderecki does really well here is, although it's a really unpleasant sound, the title of the piece should tell you that it's not going to be really something that sounds quite nice. But what he does really well is that he takes individual clusters that individual instruments are playing or individual sections are playing, and what he does is he sustains them for a long period of time and then adds in a new cluster, okay, on a different instrument, which changes the sound, changes the kind of atmosphere of the piece, and it just builds layer upon layer of cluster. So remember, cluster notes that are really, really close together. So what you'll be able to do now is make sure that those boxes, the one for cluster and the one for discord, are now filled in before we move on to the next concept. So next up what we have is the genre of Impressionism. So Impressionism is a style of music which uses the whole tone scales. Now before we learn what the whole tone scales are, I think it's important to have a wee listen to what Impressionism music sounds like. So what we've got here is an example by Debussy, who we looked at the start of this presentation, and one of his most famous pieces, a piece called Clair de Lune. You should recognise it. So if you do get a chance, I would go and listen to the full piece. It really is really nice. Impressionist music always is quite pleasant to listen to. It's really relaxing, it's really chilled out, and that's because of the way that the scale is created, which we're going to look at next. So the whole tone scale in Impressionism music really does what it says on the tin. It's a scale which moves up or down in tones only, so there's no semitones. So for example, it will move that first one that you can see at the top, it moves from C up to D, to E, then to F sharp, which is 2 semitones, to G sharp, to A sharp, and then to C. So when you play them all together, you get this really dreamy sort of texture. Okay, now there's only 2 whole tone scales that exist, because if they were to have any others, then it would just be repeating the 2 patterns that you can see on screen, just starting on a different note. So the bottom one starts on D flat, then moves 2 semitones or a tone up to E flat, then another tone up to F, then G, then A, then B, then ends on D flat again. So if you were to play them all together, sorry, not B flat. Okay, so moving in whole tones or 2 semitones at a time gives us the whole tone scale. What you can now do, folks, is complete the next task, which is similar to one that we did earlier. What you're going to be doing is completing a Google form and identifying whether you think the examples that are playing are a major scale, a minor scale, or a whole tone scale. So folks, we've now come to the last concept that we're going to look at in this week's lesson, and we have come now to minimalism, which, as you can see on screen, the minimalism is a style of music which uses very few changing notes or rhythms and has a sparse texture. So we're going to look at a few examples of this, but what sort of image I want you to keep in your mind is the idea that minimalism is kind of like building with Lego blocks, okay? So they're very, very straightforward, they're very simple in their shapes and their sizes, and you can build loads of different things using the same sort of ideas, okay? So as you can see at the bottom there, we start off with 1 block, we then have 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the same sort of idea, as we'll find out, that loads of minimalist composers use in their pieces.
Minimalism was an avant-garde musical movement originating from America in the 1960s. It is typified by simple but evolving phrases and was influenced by the minimalist visual arts scene of the 50s. Musically, you might hear elements of orchestral music or jazz, as well as some of the earliest sampling. Minimalism simplified music but also made people appreciate it on a more subtle but complex level. Terry Riley's In C is pretty much the first piece of minimalist music to reach public consciousness. It is notated as 53 short phrases of varying length, and it's up to individual performers to choose a phrase and a starting point. The only thing to remain constant between performances is the pulsing root note. Average performances of In C can be just over an hour long. Other minimalist composers of note include Philip Glass and Steve Reich. Minimalist music is made up of phrases referred to as cells. These can be played as a round where the instruments start playing the same phrase at a different point to create a hypnotic, layered pattern. A cell is repeated and gradually developed throughout a piece, often ending with an entirely different phrase to the original. Composers might lengthen or shorten the duration of notes in a cell, or they could entirely remove notes or add new ones. Those are some of the core ideas used when composing minimalism. A minimalist ensemble is usually non-traditional but can include vocals, orchestral instruments, guitars, pitched or non-pitched percussion and synthesizers.
I don't tend to write for standard ensembles. I don't write for the orchestra. I don't write for actually string quartet. All my string quartets are really three quartets because I keep wanting to have these doubling of identical instruments. And if you have a string quartet, well, where's the other viola? Where's the other cello?
It's Gonna Rain by Steve Reich features a sample of a street preacher repeated and played with for about 18 minutes. He was applying the same repetitive techniques used in instrumental minimalist pieces to a non-instrumental idea. After a while, as a listener, you pick up on the slight melody in this voice and it does become like music.
So what I think you'll have seen from that video is the idea that minimalism really does take all these little building blocks of ideas and really does stretch them out into full-length pieces. So for example, in C, that you heard quite a lot of in the background, there's 52 or so different ideas, perhaps all happening at the same time or being played at different times, some being played loud, some being played quiet, some not playing at all, some playing all the time, and there's over an hour's worth of music from just those 52 little tiny ideas called cells. And this next piece that we're going to look at really does, it's a much smaller scale work than in C, but it's called Music for Pieces of Wood by Steve Reich that we looked at the start of this lesson, and this will give you an idea of just, again, how little stuff you need to make minimalism really, really work. So what we have right from the start here, folks, is an ensemble of percussion instruments, and there's one performer that starts, and all they are doing is playing single notes on a set of wooden sticks, okay? And that pattern just keeps going and going for the entire length of the piece. What you then have is other performers joining in with sort of different ideas. And if you listen to the full, I'm not going to make you listen to it, but if you listen to the full 11-minute version, you would find out all these different permutations, kind of different repetitive patterns that happen and move out of phase with one another to really create this huge full-length piece of work. So there we have it, folks. That's us covered all the concepts that we were wanting to look at today. Before we recap our learning intentions and success criteria, just to see how we've gotten on, there is one final thing I'd like you to do. There are instructions on how to do this on the Google Classroom, but I would like you to try and download an app called Clapping Music, and what you get to do is actually play along with a piece of minimalist music. So the first two sections of that last piece of music that we looked to also come from a smaller piece called Clapping Music by Steve Reich. So you might have heard of it. You might have seen, I'm sure there was a TikTok video about people doing this as well. So you get to have a go of it now as well within the app. If you could film your screen of you having a go and maybe post some videos to the Google Classroom just to see how you're getting on, that would be brilliant. But the instructions are on the Google Classroom and you can now watch me have a wee go of it as well. So there we have it, folks. We have come to the end of this week's lesson. Again, on screen you can see the learning intentions that we sought out to meet at the start of the lesson. We've revised the classical period, we have discussed what modern contemporary means, we've looked at and listened to different concepts associated with this period, and hopefully you've been able to note down some important features about these concepts. So hopefully you're successful now in identifying different concepts within the areas of modern contemporary music that we have discussed. So there we go, folks. That's us finished for this week. Thank you very, very much for checking in. Just make sure that you complete all the tasks that are on the Google Classroom as well. If you've got any questions, please just email your classroom teacher. And until next time, stay safe and we'll see you soon.